So obviously, if I'm going to talk about color theory, I'm going to talk about Isaac Newton. He was primarily the one who was responsible for really observing that colors have respective frequencies. And he did that through use of a prism. By using a prism and trapping the light, reflecting and refracting the light, he was able to separate those out in a spectrum, or spectral color arrangement, or a rainbow. And so he was one of the first to not observe this. We've all seen rainbows, but he was the first to actually embed a theory with it. So what did that give us? In terms of art, it gave us the spectral prism, which is our color wheel. And our color wheel is the foundation in working with and understanding how to manipulate color in order to do a lot of things. In order to create vibration, in order to create eye agitation, in order to create naturalism, realism, right? The first rule of thumb in a painting class, if you're looking at a still life, is if you're painting an orange, you know, the type of fruit, in order to make the orange darker, you don't add black, you add its complement. And the complement is directly across from that color on the color wheel. So you would actually add blue to that orange on the shadow side in order to create a turn of that volume. The Munsell color wheel was much, much later. And this provided us an organized set of colors that had assigned numbers so that the designers essentially could work in the commercial world with artists in order to get the very, very specific color requests that they may have had in their mock-ups, right? In their watercolors. If a fabric illustrator or designer is making a wallpaper, those colors are going to be very, very specific. So this Munsell color system allowed us to just simply assign numbers and be able to have a go-to that was dependable every single time. So there's the additive process of seeing color, and then there's the subtractive process of seeing color. If you've ever been in a theater, you've seen what's called gels, and gels go over a light. Those are colored, transparent, films. And if you take 3 gels, green, red, and blue, and you shine them all over intersecting in the exact same place, you will get the color white. No white. No color. You will get white. And that's because that uses the additive process. So all of those colors combined cancel out because it's all the colors in the spectrum. So according to basic color theory, if you take and you combine all 3 of the, in additive, the primaries are green, red, and blue, not yellow. If you take the 3 primaries in the additive method using simply light, all of those colors combined, all the colors of the rainbow, are all white, versus the subtractive method of color. And what the subtractive method of color is using a physical embodiment of color, so like paint. So if you take the 3 primaries in paint, what are the 3 primaries in the subtractive process? What are your known 3 primaries? Good. So it's red, yellow, and blue, right? And using red, yellow, and blue, if we combine those all together, what's going to happen is you're going to get something very close to black. So it's an opposing logic that uses either light or physical pigment, which are 2 different things, right? Everybody get that? Okay, you can have a seat if you want to make yourself comfortable. So when we arrange these things on the color wheel, we simply have our primaries, our secondaries, and our tertiaries, and it's 12 simple colors. So if we use those in paint and we combine them all together, that's what we get. So our simple primaries, red, yellow, and blue. Our simple secondaries are red and blue mixed together because they're next to each other on the color wheel, which makes a purple, right? So it's just simply 2 colors together. And then we get our tertiary colors. And the tertiary colors might be yellow mixed with green mixed with yellow-green. Or, I'm sorry, yellow mixed with green, which makes a yellow-green, right? The tertiary, the in-betweens. And you all know that. Simply put, when we think about color as it relates to art, we're always thinking about temperature. And temperature, essentially, a mnemonic device is this. If it's a color that you see in a landscape in the middle of the day, greens, blues, some purples, what you're going to get are cool colors. If it's a color you would see in a fire, yellows, oranges, reds, sometimes purple and that little fire thing right in the middle, but it's primarily your reds and your yellows, then it's going to be a warm color. Now, there is the in-between, right? And if we look at our color wheel, we're going to see a green, like blue-green, that sort of straddles warm and cool. And we're going to see a red-violet that also straddles a warm-cool. So if you're a painter, I have my students buy every normal color, red, blue, yellow, base colors. I also have them buy the alternative temperature of that color. So they might have red, which is the color of his sweatshirt right now, his sweatshirt right there, medium red. If I were to have him make a blood red, like a deep purple red, like a alizarin crimson, that would be a cool version of a warm color. Y'all get that? Okay. So we know what warm colors are and what cool colors are now. A hue is simply the name according to the color wheel. The value is its lightness or darkness. And you, of course, know, hopefully you've all done this exercise, where a tint is any color mixed with white, and a shade is any color mixed with black, which actually do make colors. If you take yellow and you mix black with it, what you're going to get is olive green. Yes. So monochromatic are simply color harmonies that are of the same color. So if I'm going to have you do a drawing entirely in a monochromatic hue, it would be all in, say, just reds, right? It would be red in black and white, or it'd be all the versions of red, okay? If you're working with complementary colors, those are simply the colors opposing each other, which we already went over. All right. So we already talked about the additive and subtractive process. Paint is different than light. Okay? Light is the additive process. Pigment employs the subtractive. One gets white, one gets black. And it's something close to black. It's not really true black. So here's two examples of what we might see when we're seeing tints and shades. So it's the same artist, Pat Steer, who's known for doing non-objective abstractions, very expressive paintings. And of course, it will desaturate the color. Anytime you add white to a color, anytime you add black to a color, you're pulling the intensity of the color away. Okay? Y'all understand that? So if we were to take a Xerox copy of the color wheel, you're going to get the various values in that color wheel as well. Don't forget about that. Purple is not the same value as yellow, right? Why is that important? Because we're typically going to add the darker colors to maybe imbue the shadow side of a face. We won't really add yellow to that, even though it might be a warm shadow, okay? So B is simply a tint. C is adding gray, so black and white progressively in order to get that value. You'll see that. It's a really dull color. If we look at D, however, what's happening is that yellow-orange is mixing with the blue-violet, which is its complement. And I want you to compare the two things. In order to make a color darker, what did I tell you about making an orange, painting orange, drawing orange? So that would be an example of that. So if we have an orange, as it moves into shadow, we're adding that blue, or the equivalent of that blue. So it's our job to identify what color that is on the color wheel and really find the closest thing that is opposing it. So it might be a reddish orange, which would change it from being blue to more of a cool blue, okay? So if you add black to a color, you are not actually making it more colorful. You're dulling it. So if I am painting flesh, or if I'm drawing a person in colored pencil, and they are Caucasian flesh tone, that's a kind of dull orange, okay? Or a dull pink. And if they're a dull pink, like me, what's the complement to red? Green, blue, green. So I'm adding a touch of green to that pink in order to create the shadow side of my face. Does that make sense to you? If I'm drawing a red shirt, I don't add black into the crevices to make those shadows. I add green. You see? So what that does by adding gray or by adding the complement is it changes the intensity and the saturation. So the intensity of the color is the purity, and the saturation is how intense that color really just sort of affects your eye. So it's the brightness or dullness of a color. Okay. We have physiological and psychological responses to color. It's not bunk. It's actually measurable. When you paint a dining room red, it makes you hungrier. Really? Yes. When you paint a bedroom in seafoam colors, very, very light pastel colors, it is a calming effect. Your heart rate will actually lower because you have an association, okay? It is a psychosomatic response. Your mind sees it, you make an association with it. It might be cultural. It might be based on that time that you got thrown into ice water, right? And your heart rate will lower, okay? So we culturally have different associations according to how we were raised. So the color white in Western European countries is generally associated with purity, but the color white in Asian countries is generally associated with death, absence, whereas we use black to associate with death, right? So without light, you will not have color. It does not exist. If there is no light, there is no color. It's a very simple idea, but the theory behind it is a little complex because here's why. Bless you. If I'm looking at one of my students wearing a red shirt, that shirt is not actually red. It's every color besides red. So the frequencies that are actually bouncing back to my eye is the absent color, making it appear red. Do y'all understand? If light did not exist, he wouldn't have a color to that shirt. It's an effect. And because of the way our brains are, absolutely, we will all pretty much see the same color unless there is some sort of pathological or, error, genetic error, right? Like color blindness. Yeah. So, just to reiterate, when light strikes something that is red, all the colors except red are absorbed. And so what bounces back is red. It's not actually red. Okay? So in seeing value in color and seeing and determining whether or not someone is colorblind, we actually assign two colors that are opposing temperatures. We put them in the same scape, but we make sure that they are the exact same value. So we can find two different temperatures that are the exact same value, such as in this test here, which was invented, I think, in maybe the 30s around-ish by the Japanese, I believe. And so what do you see here? Number 8. 8. Men typically are more likely to be colorblind than women. I don't know why. There are spectrums of colorblindness as well. Generally, colorblindness is not seeing the world in black and white. It's seeing the frequencies differently than the majority of the people do, right? Which doesn't allow for an easy navigation in relational identification, right? Oh, you see red, stop sign. Well, I see more of a green stop sign, right? It's not that the color is not seen, it's that the color is not accurately seen. So, atmospheric perspective. We talked a little bit about that in the beginning. What is atmospheric perspective? Well, it relates to the rule that warm pops and cool recedes. That is something you need to memorize if you're going to be an art student. Warm pops, cool recedes. If you're inventing a landscape, in that landscape, the thing that is closest to you is going to be the warmest tone. Okay, even if it's just a field of grass. Anytime you make something cooler, it's going to sit in the background. All right? Now, of course, that can relate to atmospheric perspective, obviously. But in atmospheric perspective, using that rule, what happens is if you haze it out and you lower the contrast and you lower the specificity and you make it a little cooler, that thing will fit far, far back into the background. And it will diminute, and your identification of it will be in deep, deep space. Right? You all see it in photographs. It's easy to see. So memorize these if you don't already. Purple goes to yellow, red goes to green, orange goes to blue. That's pretty much all you need to memorize in order to, work your way into the art world. However, it would be good if you did memorize the secondaries and the tertiary complements. Those are important. But I get away with this. Purple goes to yellow, red goes to green, orange goes to blue. Purple and yellow are the Hornets, red and green are Christmas colors, and orange and blue, I don't know. There you go. Whatever you need in whatever mnemonic device you need in order to identify this, to be able to retrieve it, memorize it. When you pair two complementary colors together that are essentially the same value, and very intense, they've not been desaturated, what you get is an agitated eye. And the purpose of that is to irritate you, right? So if I'm a graphic designer, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to use my school logo on my shirt in red and put it on a green shirt of the exact same equivalent value. It would be very difficult to read. It blurs the edges, it becomes less defined, it irritates you. You understand? Which is why graphic designers really need to know color theory. Now, if you're a visual artist like Leon Golub, who's making images of torture, okay? Literally, giant images of torture. They're like 20-foot paintings. They're huge. If you use complementary colors, you're increasing the psychological aura of the work, the stress. It becomes stressful to look at, and the content is reinforced by that color arrangement. You understand? When we take two opposing temperatures that are very similar, not similar in value, but opposing, talking. When we take complementary colors that are dissimilar in value, what you will see is movement. So even though you see contrast, what you're seeing is these little gears moving on the slide. If they're highly intense, and your face is right up on it, you will see movement and radiance. Back and forth, back and forth. You will see that?
I see it spinning.
Yes. Another effect, another play with color theory is what we call optical mixing. And optical mixing is not actually mixing the two paint colors together. It's putting them close together so that your eye appears to mix them, or your brain appears to mix them. So what we have here is a painting by Chuck Close. These are very, very large face portraits. And through an adaptation that he had when he had a spinal occlusion, which is sort of like a spinal stroke, that rendered him essentially a quadriplegic, like he has very, very, very limited movement of his fingers. He had to relearn painting. And he had to relearn painting on his stomach, on a hospital bed, basically holding a brush with his teeth. So he was a photorealist before he started making those. Now, it took him a long time to figure this out, and so eventually he regained a little bit of movement and motion in his arms. So he is wheelchair bound. But he's able to move his arms and basically have an assistant strap a brush to his wrist so that he can make these little circular motions. So if you get close to one of these paintings, oh, I didn't get that close, what you're going to see is tiny little concentric circles that appear to mix from afar, that are not actually the colors that you would normally assign. You see? It's essentially based on the science of the 19th century notion of pointillism, yes. But these are not dots, though. They're very different. They're sort of blobs. I call them blobs. So there are different ways to make harmonious color arrangements. I generally don't subscribe to this, but you know, these are easy things to rely on, especially if you get a gig you want to, you know, move through quickly. If you use an analogous color scheme, that's basically anything that's close to each other on the color wheel. The presumption is that would be very favorable, that it's very aesthetically pleasing, right? So that's one way, analogous color schemes. Then we have a monochromatic color scheme. It's all the colors, you know, of, say, in this photograph, greens. And then we can kind of play with those things by basing our ideas on temperature, value, neutrality, and brightness. And we've already gone through what all those things are. So, yet again, this is what happens when we have tints, shades, and adding the complement. Adding the complement will sometimes appear in painting class like you're actually just mixing browns, which if you look around the room, you'll notice a lot of browns because that's actually the way the world is constructed. We can de-intensify a color by simply adding its complement as well. So you see the blue, you see the orange, and then incrementally as you mix both colors together, in the center you get a neutral color. A neutral color. And it will look like gray or it will look like brown, and it will be depressing, but that is the way of the world. All right, simultaneous contrast. Now, a lot of my students will, because of high school, they'll make a drawing or a watercolor, they'll make a work on paper, and then you've got to mat it. And what they're going to do is they're going to always go to a black mat. Here's what you don't know. If your painting or drawing or whatever it is on paper deals with color, and it's intense color, because you're taking that color and you're putting it on black, that's all right, black will desaturate the color that's in that image. So it is actually, professionally, really bad form to use a black mat if what you're trying to do is make an image about color. And it's evidenced right here. I want you to see how the black really does change the way you perceive the exact same color. Do you see that? It plays with the edge. It plays with contrast. The color looks lighter on the black. See that? It'll sometimes play with the intensity. Yes, sir, you have a question?
Can I make an observation?
If it's quick, yes.
One looks like a block on top of the table, the other one looks like a tunnel.
Absolutely. It does play with space as well. It plays with your perception of where those things stack in space. Absolutely. So simultaneous contrast is also evidence beyond just black and white as well. These are exactly the same green. You see how differently they appear? Someone might be colorblind. So if you look at the image on the left, what we're seeing here is green that's sort of losing its edges and decreasing in saturation. It doesn't seem as intense, right? It sort of looks like an orb, right?
One's bold, one's
exactly.
hidden.
You're right.
Looking at a lily on a pond.
So if we use opposing temperatures, what we're going to get is high contrast, and we're going to get a very, very sharp, distinctive edge, right? And Johann Itten is the guy who actually invented this. It's a book that many, many, many art schools require. I own it in my collection. And it basically shows one color combination after the next in order to evidence the theory of color. And if we take gray, a completely desaturated gray, black and white, this is just black and white in the center of these, and you put it on a color, it will appear to have a temperature. You all see? It's the same, it definitely is the same color, but it will change the temperature reading. It is just black and white. Just black and white. No color to this gray at all. So we did this again and again and again, and it basically is meant to evidence how you should use color in order to benefit, support, or challenge your idea, right? In order to know the rules, you can break them. But if you break them, it should be with intention, right? Everybody says in art school it's about teaching you the rules. No, I think it's about teaching the rules in order to manipulate your audience, either pro or against. So I've included some landscape drawings as well as some other subject matter using colored pencil. So we're going to start our section on colored pencil. And colored pencil is a really good place to start. We're going to start on we're going to start on toned paper, gray paper, so that you can actually develop layers, successive layers, in order to get a sort of substance of transparency and manipulate the colors so that they're not completely flat, like acrylic paint. Many of you probably worked with acrylic or gouache in your design class. That's a very, very flat, opaque color. In drawing, we actually use transparency for our benefit because we're not typically adding white. What we're doing is we're using the white or the color of the paper in order to show through. So it really does work like, you know, how you imagine watercolor to work, which is transparently. And so you'll see a lot of different manipulations of the surface, mark making, layers, filling in the grain of the paper even. Some people are super, super, super intense about that. Another landscape artist that I'm going to give you homework to watch his film on, his name is Rackstraw Downs. He's British, but now he lives in the United States. He goes back to the same place over and over again every year and makes a very small painting that is intensely well observed. And here are some of his drawings, and then a painting over to the right there. And all of these are from direct observation. He doesn't use photography. And so all of the distortion that you see, the sort of turn, that weird, like, what do we call that, fisheye view, that's due to sighting and measuring of a very large space. So in his work, what he's doing essentially is on a toned ground. So many painters always paint on a toned ground. So he tones his ground orange, and then he just sort of painstakingly uses this sort of grid method. So he measures in order to get that grid method. He's not working from photos, like I said. And he uses essentially little blobs of abstract shapes, forms, values, in order to make some sort of semblance of a really beautifully observed sort of neutral landscape. Many of the landscapes conceptually are landscapes we wouldn't otherwise look at and consider beautiful. You can see color in black and white. The first thing that my students do when they come into a painting class is they go for their white and they go for their black for any black or white object. And that's not necessarily the way things work. Black and white have temperatures. The light coming through that window, even though it's a little dark and rainy today, is blue. So if I have a black pair of patent leather shoes like that, and I stand in front of that window over there, the highlights are going to be blue. Baby blue. And the more acutely aware you become of temperature, the more you'll see color where you don't expect it. C.J. Henry works with photography. She's a photorealist, and she works exclusively with colored pencil. So what some of her work has been, she's very sort of popular, right? People love her because they're ooh-ah, and some of them are very large. But I actually think that her most interesting body of work was these little Rorschach tests. And Rorschach are those little ink blot tests that they do to you, that a psychologist would do to you in order to establish your subconscious. In order to establish what's in your subconscious, what you're seeing identifies, or links with how you're feeling, right? It's a bat, oh, I'm having dark thoughts, right? It's a murder, oh, I'm having violent thoughts. So she created these sort of painted Rorschach tests and then drew them, which I think is a really interesting sort of conceptual approach to what it is she's doing, which is trying to make magic out of just pigment, which is what painting is, right? And it's about what you see in it. So they're abstract, but ultimately it plays off of your notion of you seeing something naturalistic. So I think they're kind of fun. Julia Randall also works exclusively with colored pencil. These are very large. I've seen a few in person. I'd say they're about 22 by 30, or 30 by 40, like 3 foot by 4 foot. darn near big. She started out by doing these sort of like very sci-fi, lips blowing spit bubbles, or drawings of chickens with human lips, sort of hyper-realist. And now she's working on these drawings of chewed up gum, which also do play with the notion of, is it abstract or is it representational? Because they're not easily identifiable right off the bat. And once you know what they are, you can't stop seeing them. Christoph Schmidberger is actually a painter, and he does these weird figures, sort of in LA environments. They're very vacuous and very much like influencers would be. Young people doing weird things that are hyper rich. So the narratives are very much about how sort of empty the lives of these young people are, how they want to be seen, their beauty, etc. But he does a really good job with colored pencil, I think, in translating the sort of soft, saccharine subject matter to how he's actually treating the material. Lindsay Laventhal is a fairly recent artist who does these sort of ethereal portraits of people, of their heads, on toned paper with exclusively colored pencil. And that is it.